So for this board, I want to look at a U-shaped framework that allows us to imagine what a linear system might look like from a nonlinear sense of dimensionality or directionality. It could give us a picture of the stages of a transformation, and or it could also help us look at how the brain systems work um, internally, which intuitively we have an awareness of, because pretty much we can notice that energy descent and energy ascent are always at work, bouncing off each other, and we're interested in when that kind of reaches some 0 point and rises up, um, within maybe certain rare moments when an actual integration happens. That word is so often used. What does it mean to integrate, and why is it so hard to get to a place maybe we can call oneness? Normally, I might say the unitive state, but for now, maybe let's describe it as that. Um, like in this model, people tend to use this word a lot. Let's bring it up early just so it's mapped out. Because for many people, the awakening is usually the first stage. But what if it is in fact somewhere in the middle? Um, so over here, let me write down what might be the initial state we start out with. Satisfaction might be called happiness, contentment for many people. And when folks walk into our healing spaces, a lot of the motivation or the reason for coming is actually coming from there. Like, get me what I need, bring my energy levels back to normal so I could go back to work and somehow stabilize. So at this point, I want to bring in the chemistries of the stages. That maybe there are chemicals of change or chemistries of the awakening process that comes alive when we facilitate all sorts of processes. And people are so involved in these different types. So let's say maybe for now, if we were looking at, let's still retain the upward arrow. A lot of people would be interested initially with chemistries of the uppers, like there's this upward motion that becomes the main motivation for many people because of the pain avoidance and pleasure seeking patterns that are embedded within us from a very deep story. Like these have been embedded in us ever since we derive pleasure and rewards from certain behaviors, and then we experience somehow negativities from going into certain areas in the animal and human experience. So the common stimulants that would keep people from diving maybe deeper into the you would be, let's say, we can bring up dopamine for sure. Dopamine is normally considered the satisfaction drug of the body. And then maybe we can bring up epinephrine, which is more commonly known as adrenaline. So whenever we experience this, our bodies excrete certain neurotransmitters and hormones that allow us to feel good, to be physically strong, and to stay focused and to be very present in our memories, our memory patterns. So contrast to the stimulants would be the downers. That we have these internal chemicals that creates the lowering of our energy levels. And we might describe the more obvious ones, like serotonin is a relaxant neurotransmitter. It creates effects that allow our brain processes to slow down. We can think about acetylcholine, um, which would be a hormone that the body releases that counteracts the adrenaline system. It's a it's a downer. And down here, maybe we could think about cortisol as the stress hormone, the stress chemical the body produces whenever we experience high levels of stress. So we can maybe think about two sections here. Oh, sorry for the dogs. I have no control over my environment. Maybe that's connected to what we're talking about, so let's just go with it. Um, in my model, having observed thousands of people's minds and bodies, I normally observe 12 stages at work. And these stages are very, very useful in tracing how and why a full cycle doesn't arrive here. Maybe there might be inhibitions that exist in certain areas in our brain mapping and our multi stages in the transformation that maybe are there for a reason. And we can look at this through other visuals and other models later. So, one thing we can observe as a possible second stage would be that there is a level of dissatisfaction when people don't really get what they used to get habitually based on old habits, old addictions, like when they start to experience certain tolerance to stimulant chemistries that used to provide happiness, a first level of depressant downer energy or an energy descent takes place within the satisfaction, upon which when people spend enough time there, um, there is a release process that then takes place. And those who conduct really deep spiritual work, they understand this. They understand purgation. It's when you start to puke out like all of your dissatisfied, depressive, controlling patterns that don't really serve you anymore. And the longer you spend time in that, then you start to go into a threshold, moment. It's when so much stress takes place because of the that moment in your life when really like what used to stimulate, what used to bring you up, simply isn't working anymore. So we can imagine that addiction might be happening um, throughout the certain region where you're still trying to bring the energy up, well, while without control. There's some deep body and psychological wisdom within us that brings us to this threshold moment where I've had enough. Like what used to please me just isn't doing it anymore, and I'm forced to make this internal emotional and body decision to just let go. Um, so before we reach some sort of integration point, initially we need to go through, of course, an aphasia, if we were to use that symbolically, like a letting go of all these patterns that have been habituated in us at an early age, that have trained us in Pavlovian ways of getting rewards, being punished, going through pain whenever we didn't achieve maybe what in Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs would be anything from the basic physiological or belongingness need or self-esteem needs all the way to self-actualization. I feel that Maslow's hierarchy really belongs more on a world or earthly level. And when you look at the awakening process, we have to consider there's more. And in fact, Maslow discovered in his own um, construction of life models. Um, let's write it down. I wasn't thinking of writing this down, but it might be useful. Physiological, and then there's this need for security, and then there's a need to belong, um, which is actually the need to be loved. And then we see that there's this next need that grows through the developmental stages of the human, where we think about reputation, we think about respect, which are basic for people within identity processes. And then supposedly the last is called self-actualization. And these are the five um, needs within the hierarchy that are normally mapped out when we go to college and study psychology a little bit. Before Maslow died, he actually wrote a book pointing out that there is this very rare need that arises in certain humans. And maybe it used to be more rare than when he was founding transpersonal psychology. And maybe it's so much more common now. So he wrote a book before he died, and the book was called Self-Transcendence. So I feel that a lot of the work that we do, in fact, seeks to catch up with Maslow's late insight um, that looks at the levels that the human undergoes. And I think he wrote somewhere that self-transcendence happens only to 3 to 5% of the human population. I feel maybe we can question that, that maybe more people go through self-transcendence now based on the evolution and involution of the human. So the awakening happens somewhere here. It could be maybe, if it's at the bottom, as one way of looking at it, it shares space with um, this other similar beautiful stage that brings about like insight and deep understanding. I feel that the awakening is when we initially first ask certain questions, and the illumination is where we get actual answers. I could use any symbol. Maybe let's put a point somewhere. I feel the heart is interesting because it's actually two question marks put together, and the point could be somewhere here at the heart of the heart. Um, so the illumination is where, when and where certain insights come because of our courage in asking certain questions. Um, So after the illumination, we're given insight and we get excited that, oh, we're getting guidance from internal resources. I'd like to act it out. So there's a tendency to apply what we're learning, what we're receiving, and we can call that choice. Choice is interesting because there's almost this schism or fork in the road where duality more or less still kind of exists there. Um, uh, it's almost like to get to oneness, we need to go still into dualities that bring about either different degrees of satisfaction um, that connotes that we still go through a lot of these processes to make sure that when we reach this place, it's authentic and true. And with success, we're bound to fail um, because a lot of the ideas and insights in illumination are, in fact, still not one. To truly get to one, we need to release the paradoxical nature of the information within consciousness that um, holds non contradictory and non dualistic um, truths so that we arrive at the place where everything actually holds truth and we reach a place where we cannot invalidate any aspect of like who we might be from a universality. So the new threshold then that jumps from here um, would be this mysterious um, area in some people's lives that bravely would go there. It's called the dark night of the soul. And that terminology was given to us by a Spanish mystic named John of the Cross. His real name is Juan de la Cruz. And according to John, the only way we could go into the unitive state or oneness is in fact to pass through here, this dark night of the soul. Um, the dark night of the soul is in many ways a way of looking very, very deeply at the institutions, the realities of this world, looking at everything that might have promised happiness, contentment, and satisfaction, and somehow every external source of energy isn't really bringing about satisfaction, so that we are forced to turn inwards. I guess you hear the gecko in the background. We're forced to look for the source from within, that we are, in fact, the source, that the body generates energy, and we need to move away from those external sources that are destroying the planet, that aren't really built upon um, that which is beneficial for all beings, you know. Um, so going back to the neurotransmitters, um, maybe we can reflect on what is happening in the. Sorry, I need to look for the. I can use any color, anyhow. We can look at the chemistries that are at work whenever we handle people well, when we give care to people. Um, Throughout this region, when we look at the arrow pointing upwards, stimulants normally are used. Stimulants would be like coffee, nicotine, cocaine, methamphetamine. Stimulants normally drive the energy upwards to keep people within levels of satisfaction. And when this starts to go down, it's when the brain starts to allow for more depressant chemistries to be used so that there is an allowance for a person to go into a downward motion. Now, probably what could be interesting is that down here there is one more type of chemical that combines stimulants and depressants. Sorry, I really would like my red pen, and I can't seem to find it. Oops, sorry. Maybe it's not meant to be. So, if you don't mind green, let's. Oh, there, I found it. You need to stay constant. For many reasons, I'm just gonna call them psychotropic um, chemicals. They can be mechanisms. They can be. They don't have to be chemicals necessarily. And let's maybe list down. I'm losing the green again. Maybe we can list down certain chemicals that come out when we experience like love, belongingness, spiritual awareness that takes place in the psychedelic or hallucinogenic modes of awareness. Um, Endorphins might be one, and oxytocin could be like another one. So when we experience very mother-like um, feelings of love, feelings of like feeling accepted, feeling like you belong, feeling like people love you. Um, these are interesting because they normally come about when we um, learn to balance out um, sympathetic and parasympathetic chemicals. So it's almost like we need to simultaneously release these, which normally aren't allowable for people who live in situations that demand that they stay focused and that they don't allow for all these stages of release, of giving up, of just melting into spirit that allows for them to ask certain questions that may not be so relevant to the boss or to certain friends and even families that need a person to stay the same. Um, so were we to look at the combinations of these, we can feel and see here that even as we go through the awakening and the illumination, we might be tempted to maybe from here, maybe even go back to old patterns that are pain avoidant, death denying, um, because this is scary. This is not really a place people would try out or want to go into. It's not always very productive, and especially if you live in the city and you have kids to take care of. Um, this is a really, really big question mark. Um, what we're interested in is maybe there are ways to bring people into these in a way that don't have to bring about such extreme states. And I've seen it. I've seen it. It's possible. We just really need to understand how these can be worked out. So for now, um, maybe if you put this together and this together, maybe this could bring that about. When a combination of stimulants and depressants bring about um, entheogenic or psychotropic or hallucinogenic or psychedelic experiences. Like we can try to describe this. We have been looking at the REM stage or the dreamlike quality in which time perception starts to expand when maybe in previous um, stages in our life, time was really, really contracted and very limited. Then maybe we can see here that there's a need to stay within the the authentic, um, slow and like state of surrender without getting too excited with bringing the energy up like too fast. We can see this in the, the another model that's wave based that isn't the you, to allow us to realize that on a spiritual understanding, there is a way to hold the balance between darkness and light, night and day, that allows us to really solidify a true oneness, um, that we have mapped out in the previous board, um, called the Vesica Pisces. So maybe there could be greater amounts of parasympathetic nervous system chemicals once again in the dark night of the soul, whereby we are allowed to experience more sympathetic nervous system stimulant chemicals, like here, because of our excitement to work on the many ideas that seem to bring possible success that might need to be balanced out somehow with some levels of failure, just to give us guidance mechanism that make sure that when we come into this stage, um, it is a true and universal oneness, and not just something ego is still filtering in ways that are hiding um, uh, addictions and attachments that are still very much based on this. Um, you know, like this really can also just describe the movements of the body and the movements of the music that construct how a playlist brings about a full cycle, so that you might have in your song elements or your music vocabulary a library of sounds and techniques in holding the body that brings about the allowance of these, and then these, and then the allowance of that, and then the deep compassionate allowance of this, before eventually bringing people in a state of unity, and then a very, very slow process of coming back to a new human. And who knows how long that would take. Maybe you can show us that it doesn't need to be that long. So thank you for looking at this together, and you could possibly have questions or inhibitions or additions. Maybe you're seeing things that I may not have seen. It's really up to you. For now, I share with you just things that might have been observed in the inner dance process over many years of sharing this work. And in fact, this board is quite old. I used to work with this as early as 2011, which is 10 years ago. It is, in fact, only now that I'm coming back to this, primarily because I don't think I'll be able to share some of the next boards without showing you where things are scaffolded, where things initially are mapped out before we go into the complexity. This really simplifies a lot of the things we undergo. So, if ever there was an actual framework that comes purely out of inner dance, it would be this. And I'm really happy to share with you. There are compassionate, non judgmental ways of looking at. Sometimes we won't really feel high. And it's in the coming into the low where we establish the authentic high, which is a low high, having no difference, because once again, we become like a baby, a wise old baby,